From Hamilton Place Strategies in Washington, D.C., this is the HPS Insights podcast.
Welcome to HPS Insights, a podcast from Hamilton Place Strategies, analyzing current events impacting the business and political communities. I'm your host, Tony Fratto, founding partner at HPS. And today, we're really lucky to have my colleague, Elliott Owensby, Senior Director at HPS, and Alex Parker, former Law 360 reporter, tax expert, tax authority, now writer and researcher at Capitol Counsel. We want to talk to Alex about the ongoing proposals and potential dramatic changes to international tax rules and the potential impact on business and the global economy. And I'm really excited to have Alex. Alex, in addition to, it's good to see you like on a Zoom. We're usually on Twitter together. And I should have noted in your intro that you're not merely a tax enthusiast. You're also a Batman enthusiast. And I'm wondering, does Janet Yellen need to be, setting up the bat signal to get global minimum tax done? Is it going to take superpower intervention to get this thing done? Where are we today on this?
It was a little bit easier when it was Steve Mnuchin, since he was a Batman movie producer along with being the Treasury Secretary. Yeah. And so, but I'm not going to be able to think of the right metaphor right now. But the definitely could use, if there's a tax Batman out there that they could send the bat signal for, they probably would do it right now. Right. Because the deal right now is technically in the implementation phase. So, this means the OECD is writing more guidance that's more specific about how it's going to work, implementation guidelines. But there definitely is a sense that it is on that the agreement they reached last year is on somewhat shaky ground. And there still are some issues that they're trying to sort of work out that seem like they're more policy, but they don't want to say that, because if they say they're debating policy again, they are essentially opening the whole thing up for relitigation.
Right.
So that's kind of the really short, vague way to put it.
The roadmap. Roadmap to that agreement was, this is we have to give us some credit, right? It was a multi-decade effort to try to get some level of agreement, whether it's going to work out or not. And I think everyone could agree that global tax, the system for global taxation of corporations operating in multiple jurisdictions was less than ideal. And we could argue over the particulars of this agreement, but they did get something, right?
Yeah, and that's kind of the problem, is that there was widespread agreement that the system needed to be updated. There was kind of an existential motive that, if it doesn't get updated, countries are just going to stop following the global norms that have been in place for about 100 years, and that we could end up with more trade wars, more countries just kind of doing their own thing, and that could, if really hurt globalization and cause all kinds of other problems, and then also probably would lead to more tax avoidance. So, but the particulars, like what do we need to fix, that often is where countries start to disagree. So that was the problem. But you're right, and I think it's a point that might not be obvious if you've just followed kind of when this becomes big, sort of outside the tax world news, is that this particular project has been going on since 2017. And then, so it started in the Trump administration, actually. And it kind of was a continuation of a similar project that started all the way back in 2012 and sort of supposedly finished in 2015. And they created some proposals, and they had a conclusion there, but then they came back to it because it seemed like politically there was a sense that they hadn't quite accomplished what they hoped to accomplish. And so, I mean, I remember that last year, people saying like, wow, Biden put this together so quickly. And I'm like, Jesus, this has been my life for the last 5 years.
I will say, right. So Tony and I obviously talking to all kinds of folks around town on international tax in the last, year, but even prior to that, right. And of course, dealing with the tax experts in the media and so on, right. And it's just, I think you tweeted something about this, Alex, that like when your area of expertise becomes like national news, nightly news, they're never gonna get it right. There's just statistically no chance that they successfully cover this body of work that inside and out in their 90-second hit before they show the literal dog show or the literal pony show. Yeah,
and I always heard that being on the other side because I was a newspaper reporter and I covered. I was with U.S. News and World Report here in D.C., so I always heard that complaint. Right. But then I didn't quite grasp how unnerving, I guess is the word, it can be when you're the expert and you're looking at how it gets. And it's not individual facts that get wrong. It's kind of the whole framework that people look at the issue. Which is, I mean, we could talk the whole time about that, but
right.
Look, it is a whole lot more complex than I think most people really understand, right? I mean, there's sort of there's a simplistic view that, we tax companies here and we should just tax them the same on what they do overseas, and other countries ought to do the same thing.
Right.
But what it is that you think you're taxing and what belongs overseas and belongs here for a whole lot of, really legitimate reasons. I think the politics here end up being that, American companies are merely sending they're either pushing operations overseas in order to take advantage of more favorable tax conditions, or they are then in fact also, moving the, just the headquarters, the corporate location of overseas operations to tax favorable jurisdictions to take advantage of those.
A lot of times what it is that using various maneuvers, transfer pricing, to essentially separate the taxable income from the economic activity that created it. And so when you hear about a company that has money, stored in a tax haven, kind of like a pure tax haven would be, a really small country that's maybe in the Caribbean, and that all they have is a mailbox and that's it. But the entity that's in the haven is supposedly earning billions of dollars and not being taxed at all. So in that sense, the headquarters is still where it is, and the company is still an American company most of the time, or often. But they are able to do that legally, and a lot of times it involves companies. Well, it can really be any company, but a lot of times it does involve companies that are in tech, because tech is very reliant on intangibles, IP, brands, even other things that are valuable, but you can't see them. And those have always been a tricky issue for the tax system to deal with, because they're very valuable. They are very nebulous. They tend to not have the whole international tax system is based on comparables, which means you look at similar assets to price them, and then the pricing is used as the basis for income allocation. And that's easy enough when it's oil, although you'd be surprised how hard it is when it's oil. But it's even harder if you're talking about one of the 500 patents that's in the iPhone. And so, and I think another really interesting thing that you kind of hit on was you talked about like when companies move their operations overseas. And people often talk about these two things together like they're the same thing.
Yeah.
And I guess in some sense, it might seem that way because they're both ways that companies are paying less U.S. tax. but it definitely is from a philosophical kind of point of view, and tax experts will debate this. Is it wrong for if you actually are moving the operations, the actual physical things that produce income, if you actually are moving those to a different country and then taking advantage of the low tax rate, is that wrong? Is that just an example of true competition? And that is a contradiction, which is kind of it's right there in the project that the OECD project, that a little bit of a blurring of the goals, that originally it was supposed to just be focused on digital transactions and these sort of situations with intangibles, where it's pretty easy to identify that, like, okay, this is a situation where the income has been separated from the source and it only exists there in this paper way, and that it really shouldn't exist if the system is a good system. But then they started to talk about how we want to end the race to the bottom and, really try and deal with this incentive countries have to compete against each other by lowering tax rates.
Yeah.
And that, to me, opens up a much bigger issue, because now you're talking about when, a country might actually want to lure, a factory to its jurisdiction, and they do it by offering a lower tax. That, there's some people who think that's good. Countries should compete on taxes. Other people say, well, no, that just, it's like just races down to the lowest common denominator. But it is much harder to get countries to all agree to just totally disarm when it comes to tax competition. Yeah. And it turns out even we here in the U.S. don't want to totally disarm either.
Right.
And that's what's causing some problems.
Right.
Well, it's interesting because, well, look, I am one of those people who generally feel like, countries have certain comparative advantages, and some countries have a lot of comparative advantages and some don't. And the only ones that they can really create involve things like, institutional, legal, or tax that allow them to compete for anything.
Right.
I understand obviously, the politics around that are fraught. Moving your nominal headquarters to Luxembourg or the Bahamas or Switzerland, like those kinds of, I understand it. Why people get upset about it. There's the unique case that I always think is really interesting, though, is Ireland, where someone who, my time at Treasury Department, we spent a lot of time going around Europe and elsewhere, and we'd always hear these complaints about U.S. companies not paying taxes, but they didn't care about U.S. companies paying high taxes in the United States, right? They were upset that American companies were headquartering in other places in Europe, and so the Germans would be really upset about U.S. companies paying taxes in Ireland, and so I understand. I always understood why other Europeans. I understood why the French and the Germans were upset that American companies were paying taxes in Ireland. I never understood why Americans were upset that American companies were lowering their European tax burden by locating in the low tax European country. Right. What's it to us whether, if Apple wants to pay taxes in Ireland instead of France, what is that? What difference is it to us?
It's a really fascinating question. And it's something that has been in the tax world in various different forms for a long time. And in fact, it's sort of like, it's like, well, so this came up once that, like, if on the U.S. side, the IRS looks at all the transactions and they think it's totally, we think the pricing is right, the transactions are all fair and legal, you're paying the right amount of taxable income in the U.S. But then you look at the other side and the transactions are going into a tax haven. well, does that matter? Like, does the fact that it's suddenly going there and not to like France with a high tax rate,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't change anything substantively in the US, but most people intuitively think, well, wait, there's something wrong if it's going into the haven.
Yeah.
And I almost analogize it to it. It's like if your ex-wife marries a billionaire and you get really pissed about it. Like, she's still your ex-wife either way. But
Yeah.
but what's really interesting is there are some ways the tax law just says we do. And actually, the simplest, most powerful tax tool for international tax is called Subpart F. And it just taxes U.S. companies on foreign income if it's of a certain nature. And that includes royalties, interest, rent, things like that typically are, the idea is they're not actively earned, they're passive. And then what's interesting about it is it doesn't even matter where the interest is coming from, where the royalties are coming from. It can be, in theory, back when they wrote this, and it was during the 60s under the Kennedy administration, if you've got two foreign subsidiaries and one is earning royalty income from the other, the law says that is U.S. income and you need to pay it immediately. And during the Clinton administration, they issued some regs that kind of gave you the ability, this is the check the box rules, that gave you the ability to kind of shield that from the US. And then they started looking at, okay, we need to fix that. And it caused this huge political controversy on the Hill. It was, Republicans. And one of the things they said was, Treasury wants to turn us into the global tax police now. Right. That we're going after income that's not even avoided out of the U.S. We're trying to enforce tax laws all over the world now. And that talking point apparently sort of won out because they eventually reached an agreement to not do anything about it until 2002. Yep. Then it was the Bush administration. And to this day, you have the check the box issues. Yeah. But I think in a practical sense, the reason that we sometimes do care about this is it just seems like if you are really good at avoiding other countries at arbitraging and shielding from taxation, that puts a lot of pressure on the U.S. Rules too. I don't know if I said that perfectly, but it's, right. If you are able to achieve a really low effective tax rate on foreign income because you are avoiding other countries' taxes, that gives you a really big incentive to push U.S. income out there. And that's what we saw with a lot of these structures that were, in the 90s and the 2000s. When you heard of these big tech companies, what they would, I mean, it's complicated to explain, but they would set up a cost sharing arrangement right. that takes US IP and sort of siphons it off so that they can use the foreign aspects of it. But, it really did involve income that would have been in the US, I think.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that...
We're circling around one of my favorite rabbit holes, and I propose we jump right into it, which, of course, Alex is guilty, and yes. How this interacts with not just the current structure, but also, and I also want to make sure we get to a little bit of differentiation between Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, which, to your point, now, I think when your pillars start multiplying, yes, you probably had a little bit of mission drift in whatever you originally set out to do. I'm also reminded that, Tony, we have a patent box paper from 2015. Maybe we'll put in the show notes because that's how long we've been pondering some of these things.
Absolutely, yeah.
But Alex, on guilty and related to Subpart F and intangible income, one of my personal favorite, I feel like when you start to dive into this stuff, you develop like these pet quirks of the tax code that you just kind of weirdly obsess over. And one of mine, of course, is that intangible income defined as all income minus tangible. Okay. Like, I guess that's one way to do it. Fine. But tangible income and assets obviously depreciating over time, which then somehow implies a rising intangible income, regardless of whether or not that's the case. Right. And I just, that's the system, I guess we have, but it also sort of beggars a little bit of belief in terms of that being the best possible way we could come to these kind of like consequential decisions and determinations, right?
That's a really interesting point, and I wonder, if that tends to be true, that a company's amount of depreciable tangible assets will go down over time. I mean, I think in theory they're creating new ones, and
right.
But yeah, and that, but it's definitely a controversial thing, and it's interesting. It goes all the way back to the camp draft. You guys remember that,
right?
Which was kind of an early model for what became the TCJA, and they wanted to deal with this issue of, income shifting, base erosion. And they kind of said, it's so hard to identify intangibles, so hard to come up with better rules to sort of govern them. It's better just to formulaically sort of come up with a proxy. And that's what they did. And it's like you said, it's based on depreciable tangible. And in a way, they just wanted that to sort of start a discussion.
Right.
But the discussion, maybe it happened in some tax circles in DC, but it was just kind of like when it came time to pass the TCJA, they just sort of dusted it off.
And dropped it in. Yeah.
And people joke that every single acronym in GILTI is a lie.
Yeah.
It's not fully global. Right. It's not really intangible. It's not even low taxed.
Right.
And you could even argue it's not truly income because you can't do NOLs and other things.
Right.
So it is a very, some people would say, cumbersome proxy to get at that income. And then what's interesting is it's a similar system is going to be the basis for Pillar 2 at the OECD, which is the similar minimum tax, which is it owes a lot of the design to GILTI. Other countries looked at GILTI and they said, this is a good idea. We'd like to do it. And it became part of this kind of grand bargain that the OECD project, that you would have these two different things that you need to put together. And so and Democrats, I'm sure you're aware, have long been critical of the way GILTI, they claim, incentivizes you to grow more and more depreciable tangible property offshore.
Right.
Although it's kind of interesting, the most recent sort of slimmed down version of the BBB does not get rid of that totally. It reduces it, but they still want to retain a little bit of that because the basic idea is that tangible property is the hardest thing to manipulate and move.
Yeah.
Right.
You talk to any tax director, they say, like, I can't just push a button and move a factory. So if you use that as the basis for a tax system, in theory, it'll be the sturdiest, and it can act as a way to sort of get at that intangible income that's much easier to move around.
Right. So I want to on this. This is what I wanted to delineate a little bit of. So the mirror of GILTI, or at least the cousin, I guess, is that Pillar 2, that global minimum piece, right? How do you relate the two to each other? I think we actually touched on it a little bit earlier in that, Pillar 1 effectively, I guess originally, sort of set out to tackle more of this IP type issue, some of the kind of patent issues, and now has obviously morphed into much more of a kind of political football in resolving the digital service taxes in France, and really, I feel like every week I check and someone else has something in place, right? And so,
well, I kind of want to correct you a little bit. Well, I see it differently. It actually was kind of more the reverse. It was the digital service taxes that started to spread in, I think, 2016, 2017. Yeah. And the G20 and the kind of went to the OECD and said, you need to address this. Digital transactions was the one part of the original BEPS project. That's the one that ended in 2015, that they just kind of said, well, we need to look at this longer and we'll figure it out in the future, but we can't now. Mm-hmm. And so Pillar 1 was this new taxing system to try and kind of get at these transactions that occur totally in the cloud or totally in an online marketplace. But the US felt like if you target those, that's just targeting US tech companies. because we have most of the tech.
Which is pretty much an empirical fact, but yeah, right.
Unless it's Spotify. But so what happened was somehow having guilty out there kind of changed the discussion that other countries, including the US, were more okay with a policy like that if it also included something that is like the guilty and the Pillar 2 to kind of deal with. I look at it as almost like sort of different ends of the transaction. On the one hand, you have the like where the transaction happens, and people think that deserves a little bit of income because it's where the market is. And then you trace the transaction back to the IP. That's kind of the beginning. Like that's the original idea that created this, whatever it is. Like if it's a Facebook algorithm or Google algorithm. Right. And then there's always a problem with taxing that because of all these issues we've been talking about. And so you had this kind of grand bargain. And right now the problem is it seems less and less likely they're going to be able to do this all at once, which is always a problem in a grand bargain because the whole point is everyone jumps in at the same time. So that's what's holding it up right now. And then there's also the issue of the skepticism that the U.S. is ever going to approve a treaty, and you would need a treaty to enforce Pillar 1, but not Pillar 2, which is another confusing point. But but you said you'd wanted to talk about like the similarities and differences between guilty and Pillar 2.
Yeah, well, so I saw. I was actually just looking for it on Twitter. I saw. I think it was the one of the recent tax conferences where everyone was kind of working through the OECD process, and then I believe there was someone from I think they had just left Treasury that noted that even if we finish guilty as written now, it's still potentially not compliant with Pillar 2. Yep. And so I'm saying guilty, I guess, as a shorthand. If the BBB framework moves forward, it's still potentially not compliant, which then leaves us, subject to undertax payment. And you have all these other kind of corollary issues. Yeah. So I'm just like, and maybe this takes us into our prediction markets here, but I'm at, Alex, you're the expert. Tony and I spend a fair amount of time trying to stay smart on this stuff. And I'm nearly puzzled.
I wish I could give you an easy answer on this, but it is kind of baffling. So it is helpful to, like, when you follow this all the way through, you kind of see how things develop, and it can give you kind of a better perspective on it. Yeah. So when the Trump administration was pushing this, and counterintuitively, a lot of these ideas were actually seem like they came out of the Trump Treasury. Right. Under the general idea of trying to protect, U.S. tech companies, but they never contemplated any changes to guilty. They just said, we're going to suggest this. We think it'd be good if all the other countries would do something similar to guilty. We'll help them. And then there was vague talk of some sort of exemption or grandfathering of guilty. So everyone would agree, okay, guilty is not exactly the same, but we're going to pretend like it is, so that there won't be these retaliatory type taxes, which are meant to disincentivize countries from intentionally not following the new rules. Just being like, we're not going to enforce all these, so if you want to set up shop here and not worry about all these new tax rules, come here. They wanted to have a mechanism to stop that. And so then Biden comes in, and they make this a much more high profile issue. Under Trump, it was always just this kind of thing that was always below the politics, except when he every once in a while talked about taxing French wine, which was funny.
Oh, those are the days. Huh?
And just a side note, a lot of people don't know that the TCJA had a rule like that.
Yeah.
I think most people don't think that it had anything at all to deal with that kind of, but because they wanted to raise income and because they wanted to exempt most foreign income from taxation, they needed a rule that kind of would prevent that from totally just. But anyways,
we're going to have to do a separate issue a separate episode on the oral history of how the various revenue raisers in TCJA came together. But yes,
it can be fascinating. Ray Beeman, I don't know if you know him at EY.
Yeah.
He told me that like that needs to happen because these ideas kick around and people forget where they came from and what their original purpose was.
Right.
And yeah, the TCJA just had a lot of like, I mean, they were just desperate for any kind of revenue at the end. So they were just grabbing ideas from all over the place.
Right.
But so the BBB would bring the GILTI closer to this new OECD standard. Maybe the biggest thing is that it would calculate this on a country by country basis instead of a GILTI right now aggregates. And so that basically means like, right now GILTI looks at your overall foreign ETR and overall how much foreign assets you have. And then if the ETR is too high, it taxes you. Democrats say, well, that lets you mix and match. Like you could still get away with some haven income. So they want it to be country by country. So if in a particular country you have a low ETR, then it taxes you regardless of what's happening in the other ones. And so, and that's what the OECD ultimately decided to do. So that would bring it closer. But there are just a lot of technical issues. The OECD, because they needed to have a common measure of the tax base, they decided to have something based on financial income, which opens up, it turns out that's a very complicated thing too, but GILTI is not based on that. GILTI has its own definition of income. Yeah. So even if you pulled it closer, it would not be the same technically. And then of course you have the issue that Biden pushed up the OECD to 15% for their rate, and we're still at 10.5%.
Right.
So there's always the possibility that maybe a U.S. could still get an exemption, whatever happens. And the case that the Trump administration made is that even if with these issues, GILTI is harsher than what the OECD wants to do, because GILTI does not allow foreign tax credit carry forwards, does not allow loss carry forwards. There's a lot of ways that GILTI can be kind of, it can be a significant tax for companies. Again, just because of the way it was designed and the fact that they needed revenue when they were designing it. Right. And so, and then, and this is where it gets really weird, even though it should have been known, people just didn't quite put it all together that even if we get the exemption, there still might be times when a U.S. company is taxed more because their effective tax rate in the U.S. is lower, but they'll be taxed more by a foreign country where they have a subsidiary.
Right.
And that goes back to that enforcement mechanism. It's called the UTPR. That is, the idea is kind of that, if you're the headquarters jurisdiction, you tax your company on the subsidiaries if they're too low. And then if you're a subsidiary country, you tax a company if the headquarters jurisdiction is too low. And that way everyone gets at the same rate. But this, we have tax incentives that Congress enacted, we think are fair, R&D, green energy, stuff like that. And that goes into the calculation. So if you're getting a R&D tax credit and it lowers your rate below the 15%, that means you're below the OECD rate, and that seems to have been kind of a surprise to everyone. And
I am thinking of this just now for the first time, and that is a hilarious, obviously unintended consequence. But because it's like, R&D, whatever, equity-based comp, whatever it is, there's plenty of things. To your point, Alex, we've just decided that, like, look, we want to incentivize some of these behaviors. Great. But it's pretty funny to think like, oh gosh, I invested too much in like basic R&D, and now my tax liability around the world is much, much higher than it would have been otherwise if I hadn't.
But it's the case. I mean, look, there are a lot of the very same people who who will attack even just on domestic taxation, right? Who will attack U.S. companies on their on tax evasion are at the same time the same people who are advocates for some pretty significant credits and exclusions that lower their tax burden. And, and so that, but those are the usual fights. I mean, those are to me are actually even on the domestic side.
Yeah. But I definitely see a connection there because, and this is just maybe kind of my, I don't know if you call it a pet peeve or what, but Biden, almost every speech now, he talks about the 54 companies or whatever it is that don't, that didn't pay taxes. And he keeps saying last year, it was 2020. Mm-hmm. And the implication is there's some really nefarious tax maneuver that allows them to do that. Like they've just secretly put it all in Ireland or someplace. Right. But according to the very reports, the SEC reports that these are based on, a lot of it comes down to, like you said, stock-based compensation, which tends to get a big deduction when the stock is going up. R&D, net operating losses, things that, maybe they're wrong, maybe they should be fine-tuned, but they seem like pretty clear-cut policy choices that Congress has made. And so
look, on net operating losses in particular, right? I mean, look, at the end of the day, losing money is not a tax avoidance strategy, right? Right.
And a couple of things happened in 2020. I don't remember what they were, but I think for a couple sectors, it was a tough time.
Yeah.
I think the issue, you could say the issue is you have these companies like Amazon that for years ostensibly didn't make money, but they kind of looked like a company that was making money. And you can maybe argue that the not making money was more of a, accounting thing.
But they told everyone that they were, look, that's true. They literally told their investors, don't come to us for looking for, earnings per share because we're investing in growth. And for a long time, that's what they did. That does that. There's a lot to talk about around the tax code for lots of different companies, including Amazon and others. But some of those things are real, you can't criticize him for that at the same time, because there were a lot of investors who did not want to invest in Amazon because they were insufficiently committed to quarterly earnings.
And it all comes down to this idea that your taxable income can be manipulated by whatever means, but your financial income is truer. But a lot of people would question that assumption that, when they say look, Amazon paid very low taxes, but it had really high profits according to this one measure. Those are really two different measurements that the idea is that the financial accounting is going to be truer because it's companies always want higher earnings per share. Yeah. But in some cases, it just comes down to you measure a cost in this year based on that one, and you measure it in the future, and it's not really. It just is a totally different thing. So to the extent that R&D is causing companies to have low effective tax rates, it's funny. We say that was obviously unexpected. We didn't want to hit the R&D tax credit, but if you look at the basic rhetoric of stopping the race to the bottom. If the R&D credit is allowing us to get close to the bottom, isn't this what the policy is supposed to do?
Right? Aren't we winning?
And I think it's just that nobody thought the U.S. is in that position where we would seriously be low. But again, it's in every Biden speech that we have a bunch of companies that do that. So it's I think a lack of nuance in how we talk about the sort of corporate tax issue that has led to some kind of unexpected results or implications that weren't totally grasped until they, were policy that at this point it's just being implemented.
Yeah.
So where do you think we go from here? Do you think it's possible to get, when I say get a deal done, one part of me thinks that in a way, it obviously makes sense to have, everybody in the pool. There are lots of really great reasons to have everybody in the pool and do it. But as we saw with Poland can, make it, challenging for the Europeans. Right. We are in a situation where, we're at a 50-50 Congress, very likely Republican Congress or at least Republican House of Representatives in 2024, and a Senate, maybe Republican, but at least still razor thin at best for Democrats. The opportunities to get whether it requires a treaty, if it's a treaty requiring legislation, this level of unanimity, was it too ambitious to try to do? I mean, like the U.S. Look, if they could have gotten something done and maybe they still will get something in a reconciliation bill and something with a B and B and a B, or whatever.
Whatever you want, just make sure all the B's are there. Yeah,
the U.S. would be leading in that effort. But what does your gut tell you on U.S. and overseas, right, whether they can get anything done?
Well, it's interesting because ostensibly the deal has already been reached, and I think it's unlikely, and maybe even conceptually, I'm not sure you could ever that like nothing comes of this. Because, well, I mean, first of all, the U.S., even if we don't pass anything, we do have guilty, so we do
right.
have this one part of it. But it's Pillar 2 is not based. It's supposed to be totally implemented by national laws.
Right.
So countries enact their own tax, and then they enact this other rule that combats against countries that don't do it.
Mm-hmm.
And Pascal Saint-Amans, the top tax official at the OECD, made this point several times during the negotiation that you didn't need every country to do it. You just need what he called a critical mass.
Yeah.
To do it. So then here's the question: if EU countries aren't able to do this because they aren't able to get unanimity, which they need to make tax changes, will we ever get to that critical mass when Europe pretty big? I actually don't know the answer to that question. I don't know enough about how the EU works that, what they could do individually. But it's hard for me to believe that out there in the world, at least some countries aren't going to pass these rules as a way to maybe get more income from U.S. companies, or just to have more control over their own companies.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, you can't really stop Pillar 2. It's happening. And there isn't an easy way the U.S. can just put the brakes on. I mean, we could say we refuse to implement this, but again, the project doesn't need us to. So it definitely is interesting to see how it will shake out there. And I don't know if our listeners know what's going on at the EU, but right now Poland is objecting to a measure that would implement this at the EU-wide level. It's not being passed at the EU. There's currently an impasse at the EU. They need unanimity to pass any tax changes. Poland is objecting, and the reason they are objecting is because they want it to be alongside Pillar 1, which requires some level of treaty enforcement. And so, they're a country that benefits much more from Pillar 1 than Pillar 2, so they don't like the idea of having to jump in and do Pillar 2 without that other side of it, because it's definitely not hard to imagine that Pillar 2 moves ahead, gets that critical mass, and then Pillar 1 just gets kind of
languishes. Yeah.
And then there's the question of Pillar 1. So the reason you need a treaty for that is because there are existing tax treaties out there in the world that are based on, the arm's length standard of income allocation. That's, the basis of the global system forever. So this is a totally new idea for taxing income. It only applies in certain situations. It's supposed to be kind of a small part of the system, but you would have it there, and you need some way for it to coexist with these existing tax treaties. So it is going to be difficult to do it without some changes to the existing tax treaties. And I think, what's happened is since Biden has made this such a part of his agenda, it's become very politicized, and Republicans seem like they do not support it at all. Before there was kind of this idea that if the whole business community was behind it and, Treasury was pushing for it, they could get something through. But now it just seems like you're never going to get Republicans to vote for it. And so then that leaves a situation where the US is not participating. And then it makes you wonder how many other countries would want to participate.
Right.
And, but then you're back at square one where countries do the DSTs and for the listeners who don't know, those are European taxes that specifically look at revenue from certain online activities like advertising, e-commerce, that sort of thing. And, we have threatened sanctions, tariffs against them because we view them as being discriminatory. And that's kind of how this whole thing started, is we didn't want to have a trade war over this issue. So if Pillar 1 doesn't pass, then you kind of wonder, like, where are we? Are we just going to have to live with DSTs? Is Treasury going to, or it's actually U.S. Trade Representative, are they going to get aggressive again, trying to enforce against these? Are we going to have to come back to the bargaining table and do this all over again?
Yeah.
So it's really hard to predict where it's going to go from there. So,
well, we something we did is Elliott and I and the team, we actually built a sort of a tax tracker, an index to keep track of action, which we've had little opportunity to update it. We had little need to update it.
We'll link that in the show notes as well. We had, I think we got Poland on there this week, and we did have an update from Nigeria. Again, something we don't have time to do, Alex, is why Nigeria is opposed to it, because it's not aggressive enough. But, right. We're going to, Tony, maybe we do a tax series and we can do.
You can just go around and around on these issues. Yeah. And I would love it. I love talking about this stuff, but
we'll do it. We'll do it again.
I want to keep it concise for you guys.
We might make it a series. I think there is enough to talk about, and lots of, and it is going to go for a while. So I think we have plenty of opportunity. But Alex, we really appreciate you joining us on this, heading into this holiday weekend. I think it is, I agree with you. It is hard to imagine that nothing happens. I think there's enough out there. And as we were talking about earlier with, that on the tax ideas that linger and then find themselves acted on is usually the way a lot of these things happen. So I can imagine it, but I appreciate you coming and helping us think through them. And Elliott, as always, thanks for your elucidation on these issues as well. I think we will do a series. We'll open it up and have a bigger group too, and make it a little bit more confusing for people.
Well, thanks a lot for having me on. I appreciate it.
You bet. Thanks. And thanks for tuning into another episode of HPS Insights. Huge thank you to Alex and Elliott. You can find out more about Hamilton Place Strategies work on our podcast at www.hamiltonplacestrategies.com or by following us on Twitter at HPS Insight. Alex, your handle on Twitter is?
It's Alex Parker DC.
Alex Parker DC. Yep. And Elliott?
I'm at Elliott Owensby.
At Elliott Owensby. I'm your host, Tony Fratto. You can find me at Tony Fratto. And as always, thanks for listening to HPS Insights.
Thank you for listening to the HPS Insights podcast, produced by Hamilton Place Strategies. For the latest updates, follow us on Twitter at HPS Insights and follow us on the web at hamiltonplacestrategies.com.